Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our panel today, which is titled Environmental Racism, Incarceration, and Toxic Prisons in the United States. I'll wait about 30 seconds or so to a minute before we get started. All right, again, welcome to our session on environmental racism, incarceration, and toxic prisons. My name is Ufwoma, and I'm a PhD student at MIT. In my research, I conduct community-based participatory research to produce analyses of environmental hazards, including heat, air pollution, and flooding in prison landscapes using satellite data. I will be the moderator for this session. Joining me today are 5 awesome panelists who represent an array of activities in research and organizing. May Azad is a grassroots community organizer based in California. They are a core organizer with the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons, or FTP. FTP's work is rooted in highlighting the intersections of environmental justice, prison abolition, and decolonization. Dr. Julian Scarha completed her doctorate in epidemiology at the Brown University School of Public Health. Julie Scarha will be our second panelist. She studied the associations between ambient temperature and mortality in US state prisons. Next, we'll have Dr. Carly Purdom, who is a research assistant professor for the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M University. Her work centers on how hazards and disasters impact incarcerated populations. Then we'll hear from Dr. Meet Dominic, who is the president and founder of the Texas Prison Community Advocates. Dr. Dominic has worked with legislators to file historic bills that request humane temperatures within the Texas prisons. And finally, we'll hear from Brian Kaneda, who is the deputy director of CURB, the Californians United for a Responsible Budget, which is a Black-led coalition of more than 80 organizations working to reduce the number of incarcerated people in California and shift wasteful spending away from incarceration. Just to give a bit of overview about our session, I'm going to share just a few slides about environmental racism, incarceration, and toxic prisons, and how they're interconnected issues in the United States. I'll wait for my slides to be up. Thanks. So, toxic prisons refer to correctional facilities such as prisons, jails, and detention centers that are located in areas with high levels of environmental pollution or environmental hazards and burdens, exposing incarcerated individuals and staff to a range of health risks. To illustrate some of these issues, I want to begin by just briefly highlighting some narratives from directly impacted people and organizers from some of my own forthcoming research. I just want to read some quotes. I was in prison in Pekin, Illinois, and we were right across the street, literally right across the street from a power plant that was just belching this sulfurous smelling stuff. And I know that I have asthma, and that was really aggravated there. There were times when we just couldn't go outside because it wasn't just the smell you'd breathe in. It was like your lungs would hurt. I was in Wasaga in Minnesota before, and they had no air conditioner. So you got conditions where it's 100 degrees inside and you're trying to use a little fan. These issues disproportionately affect marginalized communities, particularly people of color and low-income individuals. In this session, panelists will discuss the various aspects of toxic prisons and environmental racism in the US, the impact on incarcerated individuals, the multi-pronged movement against toxic prisons, and alternatives that are more in line with environmental justice principles and human rights frameworks. Each panelist will speak for about 7 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer. Please use the comments section to your right, I believe, to ask questions. And you can mention a specific panelist's name if you want the question to go to them. Without further ado, please welcome our first speaker, May Azad from Fight Toxic Prisons.
Hi, thank you so much, Ufoma. I'll wait for my slides to be up. Sweet, thank you. First, I just wanted to thank everyone for being here and all the organizers and Ufoma for facilitating and all of the speakers today. I'm really grateful for the invitation to share about our work. I think Ufoma gave a really great overview of like some of the impacts of toxicity in prisons, and we'll talk a little more about that. My name is May. I'm representing the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons, and we are a grassroots organization. We're not a nonprofit, we're not academics, we're not any kind of institution. We're just people, community organizers, and we work alongside incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people to draw attention to some of these issues. Can you move to the next slide, please? So this is a photo from one of, this is a photo from one of our recent convergences back in 2019. So this is something, big part of what we've done in the past is to bring together kind of disparate movement spaces from people who are studying environmental justice, like ecological devastation, also people who are doing ecological defense work around deforestation, pipeline resistance. So bringing those people together with abolitionists and formerly incarcerated people, and really creating space for these communities who otherwise might not be able to be in the same space or be in conversation to kind of share skills, tactics, knowledge, and really build bridges between these spaces. And before I get more into our work, I would like to I'm going to read a poem by Clinton Nkechi Walker, who is currently incarcerated in Pennsylvania. And in our work in FTP, we generally try to bring in the voices of currently incarcerated people whenever we're invited somewhere like this. And we weren't able to do that this time because of like timing and digital like technical constraints. So I just want to read this poem to start off because Nkechi really highlights just like the different layers and types of toxicity in the carceral system. So you could switch to the next slide, please. And you can skip this one. So this is Nkechi. Please note the address at the bottom of this slide is outdated, but the name and number are correct. So if you want to write to him, just look up like Clinton Walker and the number and Pennsylvania DOC, and you'll be able to find where he's at now. So I will read this poem. One sec, pulling it up. So Nkechi writes, "It is a burdensome task surviving toxic prisons where the effect of the environment on a person's spirit is like acid dripping on an individual's flesh, searing the human qualities off a being. The elemental conditions of prison in their own right are toxicogenic in producing toxic components and poisons within the atmosphere. These elements breed emotional dejection, conjuring frustration at having to breathe spawns of black mold and dust-filled air. Asbestos is regularly found in the dark bowels of the most ancient of penitentiary structures, while its captives are made to drink under or over-treated water out of necessity. The swarm of toxins allow no exception to the prison food either. It's a kind of service where one may find rodent excretions on trays and utensils, roaches peppered on any given meal, and a mouthful of clotted milk if a mistake is made of not sniff testing before consumption. Those acts are hostile to the psyche and harmful to the health. This poisonous atmosphere produced by malignant activities within DOC septics is constantly introduced into the quarters of men and women, capable of negatively inducing the psyche's antibodies, which protect the spirit of its captives. In some, the prison system and its toxins produce depression, anxiety, dependence, destruction, hopelessness, helplessness, irritation, frustration, aggression, suicide, and many other nouns related to such. So I just wanted to share this because I think that it really outlines like both the physical aspects as well as like the spiritual and psychological aspects that we also understand as toxicity. So it is mold, it is water quality, it is extreme heat, air quality, all of these things that we typically think about. But the ways that the prisons are socially toxic and toxic to people's state of mind also is important. Next slide, please. So this is just some background on some of the regional work that we've done supporting a movement in Alabama to get just attention to the like really severely horrible conditions there, and also to stop the construction of 3 mega prisons, which we have done by partnering with local grassroots organizations there and have actually successfully been able to undercut the financing of these prisons and stop them from being constructed. And that's a big part of the work that we do. Next slide. So I talked a little bit earlier about the relationship between like bringing together ecological defense, communities and tactics, and abolitionist ones. And so I just wanted to share this. As you can see, there's a person sitting on this tripod, and this is outside of a core civic facility, which is a private prison, or a core civic office building, which is a private prison company, one of the largest. And so this is one way that we bring together people who have these skills in like forest defense, for example, and apply those to abolitionist strategies. Next slide. So a big part of our work for the past 5 years has been hurricane disaster awareness and trying to get facilities evacuated that are in evacuation zones during hurricanes. So this started in 2018 when Hurricane Harvey devastated FCI Beaumont, and people inside of that facility died in the days following the storm, not from the direct impacts of the storm, but from a lack of drinking water. And so that's a big thing that we do now, is trying to alert people inside and outside to upcoming storms so that people can prepare, and also to push for evacuations, which we've actually been really successful in. Next slide, please. So this is some of the materials that we put out. For example, in Hurricane Florence, kind of letting people know that a hurricane is coming, that they can, asking them to kind of stockpile water, because we know that the facilities are not doing that. And then on the right, you can see kind of like the title slide for our phone zaps, which is basically like a mass call-in campaign where we'll get like hundreds of people to call these facilities and demand that they evacuate. And this has been really successful, increasingly in the past few years. Next slide. And so this is like a multi-pronged strategy. So we're spreading awareness, but we're also trying to get institutional change, because we know that there are not protocols in place. And so, appealing to FEMA, appealing to some of these like higher up federal institutions to try to get institutional change, a structural change. So it's not that we're trying to figure out which facility is going to get hit every time, call them, and instead like hoping that we can implement policies so that this just happens across the board. Next slide. And so finally, I just wanted to share an example of one of our anti-construction campaigns. This is an aerial like map of what would have been the most expensive prison in US history, that the BOP was trying to construct in a former mining community in Letcher County, Kentucky. And as you can see, it is directly on a former coal mining site and adjacent to an active coal slurry pond, so very toxic. And it's also within a few miles of the lily cornet woods, which are old growth forest and habitat for some endangered species. So this is a really clear example of the siting that we see of a lot of these toxic prisons. Next slide. So one of the major strategies, in addition to grassroots community organizing in that rural community, was that we joined 21 incarcerated people, plaintiffs, in filing a lawsuit to stop this. And it was successful in combination with other strategies. So like Grassroots like capacity building, base building, and then also media pressure, direct action for sure. And the combination of these things allowed us to stop that construction. They're actually trying to do it again right now. So we're back in this fight again, and we fully expect to win. But this is some of the tactics that we've used in the past. Next slide. And this is just another example that has like a photograph of kind of the landscape of that facility and what it would have looked like. And so this is just a very clear example of how, not only the land is treated as disposable, but the people who are being placed on these lands, or that the state is trying to, are also treated as disposable. And we're really trying to draw connections between these things and stop new construction and keep people safe. So the next slide is just our contact info, if you could move to there. So if people want to connect, you can find us on the main social media. You can reach out to us via email. I will say we are currently not collaborating with academics for the most part, unless there's like some sort of collaboration that can be of benefit to our work. We mostly try to focus our attention and energies on like directly impacted communities. And yeah, we're excited if anyone wants to reach out and connect with us. And thank you everyone for your time.
Thanks so much, May. I really appreciated that presentation. Yeah, two things I want to just kind of emphasize again that you shared was, the poem from Clinton and Ketchy Walker was really powerful and really highlighted the multifaceted nature of toxicity and the environmental injustice in prisons, going beyond that physical harm to also that physical impact, that emotional, mental, and spiritual as well. And then I've also just appreciated watching the impact of the collective organizing of Fight Toxic Prisons over the last few years, especially as it relates to disaster response. I think anyone who follows Fight Toxic Prisons, I definitely recommend following the Instagrams and engaging in the phone zaps. These are things that have direct impact on people right now. So thanks so much. And next up, we'll be hearing from Julie Scarha, who recently completed her PhD and will be sharing some of her research from that.
Thanks, Ufu. And thanks everyone for giving me the opportunity to share this work today. So yeah, as Ufu shared, I recently completed my PhD, and so this was the result of some of that work. I focused on temperature-related mortality in U.S. prisons, and today I'm going to specifically talk about heat-related mortality. And I think actually I can change the slides. So if this works, this works. So I want to give a little background about heat and health, because I think the ways that heat affect our health maybe feel very innate, but there are also ways that they're studied. And so we know these kind of causal connections between how heat affects our health. And I like to give this example from Slavic mythology. So back in the Middle Ages, or even before, there was this idea of a spirit who was named Lady Medea, and she would take the form of a woman. And during the summer, farmers would, at the hottest point of the day, farmers would leave the field to avoid her, because the rumor was that if you came across her while you were out in the field and she came at the hottest point of the day, she would give you a type of madness. And we now think that was probably a personification of a heat stroke. So just how people structured their days around avoiding heat, because we know that heat affects our health, and we've known this for a while. And typically when we think of the two main causes of exposure to heat, so the two outcomes that heat directly causes, we think of heat exhaustion and then heat stroke. And one of my advisors used to use the analogy of a car, and so I'm just going to keep using it here. And so you can think of heat exhaustion as kind of you're in a car and you've run out of gas, and so you need to refill, you need to refuel, rest, cool off, drink some water, and you're going to be okay. Heat exhaustion, as long as you take care of yourself, there's generally no long-term health impacts. And then heat stroke is kind of on the other end of that. So heat stroke is when your body temperature keeps rising. So above your normal core body temperature when that no longer can be maintained. And so your temperature starts increasing, and you can kind of think of it as an engine overheating, and your body will start to shut down as those biological processes can no longer function with the rise in temperature that's so essential for keeping our body going. And so heat strokes are rare, but very serious, often fatal, and people who do suffer from a heat stroke and survived often are living with long-term injuries from that. So these are two health outcomes that heat directly causes, but what we learn in the epidemiologic literature is that heat also isn't the only cause of other health outcomes like cardiovascular mortality or affecting kidney function, but heat is a cause of these. And so what we're learning is that there are all these other health outcomes that aren't heat exhaustion or heat stroke, but are also as a result of extreme heat exposure and an increase in temperatures. So some of these examples are increase in renal diseases, so kidney function, increase in cardiovascular mortality, increase in respiratory disease. And then we also see an association between increase in temperature, ambient temperature just refers to outdoor temperature, and suicide risk. And so like when we're thinking about how heat affects our body, right, there are all these behaviors we engage in to help maintain that core body temperature. And when we can't do that, and when our body starts working extra hard to help maintain that core body temperature, that's when we see an increase in all these different health outcomes. And also within the evidence, we know that not everyone is affected equally by heat. So there are populations that are particularly vulnerable. That includes people without access to AC infrastructure, people who are socially isolated, older adults, and people with chronic diseases and comorbidities. And that includes people with mental health disorders who might be on psychotropic medications that can then affect how your body can regulate that core body temperature and maintain that core body temperature, or chronic diseases like asthma, which can increase your risk of a severe health outcome when exposed to heat. So where we also see all these populations, there are also people in prison who also have chronic diseases and are socially isolated, older adults. So when I started my research, my first objective was to determine the association between summer temperatures and mortality inside US prisons. And I won't go into too much of the details of this study, but here's where you can find the paper if you want to read more about the methods and the data sources that I used. But I will share some of the results. So what I found looking at all US prisons in the continental US, state prisons, so that includes private prisons that are state contracted. What I found was for a 10-degree increase above the summer mean temperature, I saw that the risk of death in prisons increased by 5.2%, and specifically the risk of heart disease-related mortality increased by 6.7%. So how does this compare to other studies? Because the methods I used are quite common in the field of studying heat and how it affects our health. And so there have been lots of population studies with the US general population. And so we can see that other studies have found that a 10-degree increase in temperature increased risk of death by 3.5%. Another study in 9 major US cities saw that a 10-degree increase resulted in a 1.8% increase in risk of death. So generally what I'm finding is that the risk of death from heat exposure in prisons is greater than in the US general population. And I think the reasons that we've heard about and we're going to keep hearing about kind of explain part of why we see that increased risk. So the next, another chapter of my dissertation was to focus on the impact of air conditioning on heat-related mortality in Texas prisons. So the results of this research was also published, and feel free to check out this paper and you can read about the data and the methods. but I'll just share a little of an overview. And so some of you might be familiar, but in Texas, at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, there's a standard for jails. So the temperature in jails has to be maintained between 65 degrees and 85 degrees. But that same standard doesn't apply to prisons. So I worked with the Texas Prison Community Advocates to determine which Texas state and private prison facilities were mostly air conditioned and which ones mostly did not have AC. And you can see here, so the data I used was between 2001 to 2019. And this graph here on the left, it shows the heat index at the bottom. So you can see that as the temperature increases, so does the risk of mortality in prisons without AC, but not in prisons with AC. In fact, even as the temperature gets higher, I saw that there might even be a protective effect in prisons with AC, where the risk of death might actually decrease on those really hot days. And then I also looked at extreme temperatures. So those extreme, like once or like small percentile, or that don't happen very often days, those extreme days. And I found between 2001 to 2019, there were 271 deaths in summer months that were attributable to extreme heat. That was essentially 13% mortality during this time period that I looked at. And to give an idea of the US general population, right, same methods, usually we see less than 1% of mortality due to exposure to heat, so about 0.5%. So in this setting, we're seeing essentially a 30-fold increase in heat-related mortality, which I think is pretty major and also speaks to the conditions that people are facing. And so thank you for listening. So this work was funded by the NIH. A special thanks to the people who really helped me and guided me through this research. And then my contact info is at the bottom there. So happy to answer any questions at the end, or please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. Your research has really been, I think, groundbreaking and opened up a lot of more analysis and attention to this issue. And for anyone who's just been following, Texas and TDCJ in particular has had a really brutal summer that I think actually, the next couple of presenters are probably going to highlight a bit as well. So next we'll be hearing from Dr. Carly Pridham. On to you.
Awesome. Can y'all hear me okay? Everybody hear me? Okay, awesome. So I'm Dr. Carly Pridham. I've been working with the Texas Prisons Community Advocates for the last 4 years, I believe, on looking at the impact of extreme heat in Texas prisons. So Julie was able to, talk about some of this great quantitative data, looking at death rates and how we see temperatures affect rates of death in Texas prisons. So our work is really, or my work is really looking at what does it look like inside of prisons experiencing these extreme temperatures, and how our emergency management protocols and policies, what are the challenges of those policies, and how are they benefiting or failing incarcerated people. So next slide. I usually pull and start off some of my presentations with some of these news articles. I need to update them from this year and even last year. But this issue gets a lot of news coverage, and that's because it's really an issue of people discussing now with extreme heat of what are the rights of incarcerated people. And it brings together a lot of examples of really visible injustice, because people can feel the heat and they know what their loved ones are experiencing. There's a lot of critique on who has access to air conditioning, looking at, I see this article, prison pig barns are cooled, inmate staff sweat, looking at how even the animals that incarcerated people are charged with caring for have access to air conditioning when they, human beings, do not have access. Just to give an idea of kind of how timely the issue is. Next slide. So just a very broad introduction. Prisons are unique with extreme heat because They're not like other types of infrastructure necessarily. They're built with materials like concrete that are supposed to be secure and not break down over time, but they also absorb heat. The design of prisons restricts airflow, and there's this campus style where you think of like layers on top of layers where heat rises. So it's really difficult to, really understand how prisons are. They're much hotter places than just other types of infrastructure. There's high rates of heat-related illness among staff and incarcerated persons, but incarcerated persons are more vulnerable to heat. I know Julie talked a little bit about that. TDCJ is a system of identifying people who are particularly vulnerable, and as of last year, only about 78% of those who are deemed as high priority for getting access to air conditioning were in air-conditioned areas. So think of people who are taking psychotropic medications, they may have dementia, they may be very elderly, have other conditions, and they're not even able to get the most vulnerable into air-conditioned areas. So Texas, it's one of 44 states. We still don't quite know about what this issue looks like in all of states, but we're working on that. But we know it's a broad issue. But Texas is, it's particularly hot, and we have a, very large system with its own kind of brutal history. We only installed fans in Texas prisons in 1998, and that was paid for by incarcerated people through commissary funds. So there's really not a history of investing in hazard mitigation in prisons. And even when we do, it's asking incarcerated people to pay for it. And then also prisons are COVID-19 hotspots. We're seeing that happen again. There's just not as much coverage on it, but Texas prisons are overcrowded. There's high levels of illness and death from COVID-19. So we expect that that's going to continue to be an issue. And combining with heat, it's very difficult to fight off an illness like COVID when you're in these temperatures. Next slide. So I'm going to talk very briefly on our research and methods. Essentially, I've been working with TPCA, analyzing surveys that they collected on how incarcerated people experience these heat policies. And just looking at, are incarcerated people, are they getting resources? Why or why not? And what's the quality of those resources? How does incarceration impact getting access to resources that would theoretically reduce your risk of heat illness? Next slide. I don't think I have time for this, so I'll go next slide. So looking at water access and quality, one of the ways they reduce heat illness is they say, okay, everyone has access to water, but what does that mean when you're incarcerated? Is they can't just go buy a water bottle anytime or use a water fountain. They're primarily accessible in Texas through water coolers. And from our recent data, 13 participants said they did not get water at all distributed by TDCJ. And that's a significant number when you get how large the population is. But on the other hand, 60% reported not having a cup. So even if you do have a cooler, how can you drink the water when you don't have a cup? Every person's given a cup. You can see that small green cup on the picture. If you're not given a cup, how are you going to be able to take the water? That created a lot of water quality issues of people dipping their hands in, or unsanitary objects like a hat or something to try to get the ice out. So even if there is water, they might even have, a cup. That's something that all of us don't even think about. We also saw, when looking at that water access question, answers were generally all over the place. It was consistently inconsistent. Some people said we get it frequently. Some people said we get water, they refill the coolers maybe once a day. They refill them twice a day. But they're constantly running out because of how many people are in those areas. So access to water is a significant issue. Next slide. Next slide. I'm sorry. I think y'all have the wrong slides for me. That's my fault. Let me pull up my other slide really quick, and then I'll just. So sorry about that. Slides. Should be it. Hang on.
Thanks, Carly. If it's okay with you, you could also, continue describing it just on your
Yeah,
end if the
it's pulling
visuals
up right
aren't critical.
now.
Okay, cool.
It's not letting me pull my slides back up. It says I have too many slides. Oh, there we go. So regardless, we're talking about water. There's also the access of respite, which is one of the significant issues in areas. Texas uniquely offers access to these cooled areas, and 65% of our participants are saying they're not getting access to these cooled areas. So essentially, when the prisons come out and they say, extreme heat, it's not a big issue, we're dealing with it. These are the policies we have in place. They have access to water, they have access to cooled areas, they have access to showers, they have access to commissary where they can buy different items. Essentially, when my slides they just pulled up, I don't know if y'all can, if I can pull them up or if y'all have to.
Carly, we just have about 1 minute left, so
Okay.
maybe you could summarize on your end. Thank you.
Sure. And if anyone wants to look further at our report, you can go ahead and find that online. But essentially, those policies, the way they actually happen in prisons is constrained by the number of people that you have. But that also means that the only way for prisons to respond to heat is in these really limited ways that aren't effective. So now staff, whenever they have their regular duties that they're supposed to be doing, now they're also tasked with doing wellness checks and with refilling water coolers and with escorting people to respite or making sure people are filtering in and out of respite. In a respite area, a cooled area, that's the significant policy difference in Texas. Is they say everyone can get access to air conditioning because we have cooled respite areas. Anyone can ask and go at any time for as long as they want. But what we found in our research is that people are not, they're asking to go and they're getting constantly denied because there's small, limited spaces in the prison. It might be the barber shop, might be the chapel, might be the infirmary. And those spaces already have day-to-day uses. They're not creating new spaces for respite. And they can sometimes only hold, say, 14 or 15 people. And when you have, that's the only cooled area, and you have hundreds of people asking to request it, yeah, they're constantly being denied. And so what we're seeing is that it creates a lot of tension between staff and incarcerated people because they're constantly having to ask for resources that in the policies they're supposed to have access to, but the prisons aren't actually able to carry out those policies. So when you look at, what does the daily life look like in prisons? How does getting resources to hundreds and thousands of people on some of the lowest staff levels in history? It's not really possible. So that's how we know that these, the way we're responding to extreme heat in prisons, and this is how states across the US, across the country respond, they just don't actually work. So that's why we need real temperature regulating policies. We need air conditioning. We need policies that hold prisons to account for what their temperatures are, because the day-to-day policies of reducing risk aren't possible in the prison environment. So I'll go ahead and end there. I'm sure you can find my information online or through the program. And apologies for the mix-up, but thank you for being patient with me.
Thank you so much, Carly. And yeah, definitely would recommend looking up Carly Purdom and the heat reports that they've published in the past and a forthcoming one that should be out soon. But this was a nice transition, as now we'll be hearing more about the effort to obtain some of those policies in Texas. On to you, Amit. Thanks. I think you need to unmute.
So sorry about that. I'm Dr. Dominic. I'm president and founder of Texas Prisons Community Advocates. My background actually is in psychology, predominantly social psychology. So I think I want to come at this presentation from a different direction and dealing with the oppression within the system and looking at some of the nuances that help to continue that level of systematic oppression. So the first thing I want to start with is one of the strategies we've utilized at TPCA try is to try and pass policy, as Dr. Purdom had kind of alluded to earlier, that would force more humane conditions within the prison system. So when you're trying to impact policy, you need to understand a little bit about the system and how that the people in authority who drive policy, how that process actually works. So here I'm gonna focus in on Texas, but of course other political structures are very similar. So basically in the state of Texas, our legislative body only meets every 2 years for about 5 months. So you can already imagine that that is a very fast-paced process, not a lot of input from members of the public who are truly impacted by the situation. And I'm not going to go into detail about their process, but just that picture alone lets you know about how convoluted that process is, especially for the layperson who's involved in this process. Now, our organization works with incarcerated individuals as part of our driving force, their experience, but we also deal with our family members. And part of the reason why we are dealing with our family members is they're an impacted population that typically is kind of overlooked. They're impacted by their loved ones having the incarceral experience. They're footing the bill. They are, the saying is, we're doing time with them, right? So our family members are the folks on the outside who are going to be available to drive any strategies that influence policy change. In order for them to do that, they're going to have to be educated about how that system works. So that's the direction that I'm coming from. So looking at policy, political climate, and lack of political oversight in this situation, you can kind of see the dynamics of oppression, systematic oppression that's taken place over the years. I always say, history is repeating itself constantly, and there's nothing new under the sun. So they're simply recycling the same oppressive techniques that they've used in the past. So let's look at this really, really briefly. In Texas, we have 150 representatives and 31 senators. Our power dynamics are predominantly white, are Caucasian, lacking in diversity, lacking in experience, higher socioeconomic backgrounds, your upper middle class to higher income brackets, which usually are somewhat removed from the prison system. Whereas our family members on the other side tend to be people of color, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, lower educational backgrounds. So that kind of puts them at a slight disadvantage when dealing with these policymakers. In Texas, they also tend to be very religious, very punitive. When we look at psychological persuasion techniques, fear tends to be the main line of strategy here. So when we're combating that, we need to know that those things are in existence, and how do we empower these family members, empower those who are incarcerated, and educate them so that they can efficiently deal with this system and provoke some type of policy change. In our process, a brief history of what we've done to get legislation passed for air conditioning in the Texas prisons starts at about 2019 with the first bills on AC. And in that year, the bills didn't go very far. We didn't have a big push at that year. The next year, we got more legislators on board. There were more bills that were actually filed asking for just that 65 to 85 degrees. And then in the third year, more legislators, in third session, we got more legislators involved, and actually were able to secure funding. However, that funding did not go through. The bills have not passed because of the current culture within our legislative structure. So these are just an idea of some of the bills that we had in place. This is, let's get into the process that relates to fighting for air conditioning. This is just a slide that shows you one of the things we do with our family members, which is to educate them. A lot of them don't even know who represents them. And I'm going to encourage everybody to find out who their representatives are, who their senators are. If they want to be involved in this type of fight, you need to understand who they are and how things work. So this is just an example of the beginnings of a trainings that we did for our impact impacted family members. A lot of preparation goes into these, and we saw in May's presentation a lot of organizing, a lot of events where we utilize a lot of grassroots strategies, mobilizing and empowering people, conducting research, as you saw with Dr. Purdom and Dr. Sakara. So we really appreciate those research partners. And one of the things that I found that's really essential with that is other individuals getting involved that are not part of the typical impacted community. Why is that so important? Well, our impacted community tends to stay very secluded because of the negative stigmas that surround incarceration. So oftentimes their voices are quenched simply because of fear of retaliation or fear of the negative stigma. So when you have concrete research that presents their arguments, it helps to amplify and then empower them as well. And of course, when you're dealing with political influence, you want to bring as much evidence as possible, because the negative stereotype is that these families are dysfunctional and those who are incarcerated are also dysfunctional, are liars. So, and I'm just being brutally honest about that type of stereotype. And we need to combat that stereotype. And that is where one of the things that's really essential is research. Also things like storytelling. I call what I coin the gut punches. The things like the fact that right now Texas prisons are under lockdown and they're finding dead bodies within the prison. The fact that pigs have air conditioning but human beings don't. So those are some of the things that we use to amplify the voices, but also combat that fear messaging. Power mapping is another thing that's essential, and that goes back to understanding who people are within who your stakeholders are and how your stakeholders operate. I did have a little clip here from someone who was incarcerated that's about 1 minute, and it doesn't look like it's going to play for us, so we're going to move on. The last couple of facts that I want to mention are the experiences of those who are impacted. What drives our decisions? We speak with them. We ask them, what types of things are you having difficulty with? What would you like to see done? How would you like to see that done? And that drives our decision-making process in terms of policy, moving policy changes. I also want to mention a few things here. For example, the disappropriate rates of incarceration for African Americans. So we're also looking at an in-group, out-group type of phenomenon. We're looking at the roots of racism. We're looking at the roots of slavery that impact what's happening with the prisons. And it sounds like I need to wrap this up very quickly. Last thoughts here. Who bears the burden of unjust prison structure? The family members, incarcerated persons, and society on a whole. Overall, for those who think they are not impacted or affected by this, you are definitely affected, as 95% of the individuals incarcerated will return back to society. And we'd like them to return it from a position where they're empowered and they're strengthened, as opposed to still dealing with all the dehumanizing effects that they're experiencing while they've been incarcerated. And I see a note from Ufu that we're out of time, right? So should I just kind of stop there?
Yes, thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate you. And I'll just harp on one of the last comments that you just made, that oftentimes people think that the prison system, this doesn't affect me. Why should I care? But exactly what you said, like, these are people who are part of your community. These are people that are your neighbors or could be your neighbors, or you have family members that are currently impacted. That's why you should care. And also just because these are human beings who deserve a lot better than these really toxic environments. So last but not least, we'll hear from Brian Pineda, who's gonna share more about a California perspective. So I'll just hand it off to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And it was great to be here with everyone today, all of these incredible people doing all of this incredible research and work. Again, I'm Brian Pineda, and I'm CURB's Deputy Director. CURB is a coalition of more than 80 organizations working to reduce the number of prisons and jails, reduce the number of people in them, and shift that wasteful spending away from incarceration and toward what really keeps people safe. And we know that's our communities. CURB co-leads the campaign to close California prisons, and statewide organizers from the Grassroots are calling for at least 10 California state prisons to be announced for closure by 2025. We've been successful in moving state legislators closer toward our perspective and have made strides impacting the media narrative around prison closure. So far, 3 state prisons have been announced for closure since 2020, as well as multiple yards, a women's facility, and the contract for a privately leased state prison has been canceled. Governor Newsom has actually been the most intransigent about moving these policies forward, but we're working on it. Next slide, please. So we're learning a lot today about the connections between climate change, environmental toxicity, and prisons. And here are some more examples. We know that at least 21 state prisons in California have water sources that are contaminated and unsafe for human consumption. Yet people who are incarcerated in these prisons often have no other option but to drink it. We know imprisoning Black and Brown people at disproportionate rates and forcing them to survive in toxic cages in California and across the nation is environmental racism. And most of us know or are learning more here today about all of the detrimental impacts that people in prison face, but it's not just people in prison, it's also in prison towns. And really all of these issues affect everyone in California and across the country. These hazards are toxic water, poor air quality, dangerous soil fungus, and very well documented histories of poisoning local ecosystems and waterways. And that's true for prisons across the country. Incarcerated people face a dangerous and uncertain future, and that can't be denied. Next slide, please. In California, we are, of course, on the front lines of climate change. Recent years have shown us that wildfires, rising temperatures, and flooding that disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. It's a real thing. One of our member organizations, Ella Baker Center, they just released this incredible report. It's called Hidden Hazards, and it really uncovers the unpreparedness of the California carceral system to respond to these climate hazards. They've collected data through expert interviews, surveys of nearly 600 incarcerated individuals, and spatial analysis. And their findings underscore the unique challenges that incarcerated individuals face during climate hazards. Next slide. So here are some of the most vulnerable California state prisons when we're talking about flooding, fire, and extreme temperatures. We've heard a lot about heat today. The data in this report provides really valuable insights into the urgent need to address environmental justice within the prison system, honestly, before it's too late. And we're talking about severe illness and death at a really significant scale. We're hearing a lot about the challenges impacted people face in California prisons, from heat to toxic water to fires. In the press, much more than what we used to, which is great, but what we need is solutions. And we at CURB have a clear solution. The best way to address climate change and environmental racism in prisons is through decarceration and prison closure strategies. And our community, of course, made up of currently and formerly incarcerated people, their families, loved ones, and advocates. We care about the conditions of confinement in California prisons and beyond, but we know that investing in prison infrastructure and creating kinder or gentler cages is not going to ultimately address the crisis of incarceration in the US. Next slide. So CURB wants prison closure to happen as part of a concrete, holistic plan that includes a decarceral just transition. So what does that mean? We might know the term just transition here. Decarceration means we're aiming to reduce incarceration rates and the number of people behind bars. And we should do this through just and sustainable policies. Decarceration is a response to the violent system of incarceration. A just transition is an environmental framework for addressing industries that harm the environment, especially harm caused by extractive economies that primarily impact communities of color. Prisons are an extractive economy as well, stealing labor, resources, and hope from current and future generations. So a decarceral just transition is the process through which we support communities with prisons to shift their local economies and community focus away from incarceration and toward healthier, life-affirming investments and infrastructure. So we're saying, yes, a just transition, it should be implicit that it ought to be decarceral, but it's not. In some places across the country, they're suggesting, and we heard earlier today, replacing coal mines with prisons, right? So propping up dying economies with another dead-end economic solution. So we're going beyond responding to environmental harm here, also addressing the extraction of resources and labor from people and communities. Next slide. So in order to do that, CURB created a roadmap for prison closure. And we have 4 pillars that I encourage people to read about in our prison closure roadmap. It'll be made available to everyone. One of the pillars, the third pillar, is a decarceral just transition. And this is really the outline of the transformative process to move from a reliance on prisons to a future of equitable and sustainable investment. So we're talking about how do we take all of this money from closed prisons and invest it back into the communities in a way that's green and responsible. Next slide, please. So we have 2 tiers of just transition fund modeling in our roadmap that we're providing to state legislators. Illustrated here focuses on tier 1, which includes sustainable and green investments, public health initiatives, and responses to the climate crisis. And this funding approach ensures that communities impacted by prison closure receive the necessary resources to build a better future. A lot of these suggestions, redevelopment grants, tax credits, they come from ideas that were highlighted in New York's work to close prisons in their state. Next slide. Tier 2, equally important, the priority consideration for communities impacted by prison closure for economic recovery. So making sure folks are funded and that their funding is a priority when we're talking about closing down prisons and creating a green future. Next slide. A big piece of that is also prison repurposing. So it's vital that we develop these strategies. These strategies focus on reimagining closed prisons as spaces and for purposes that enrich communities. And that includes housing and sustainable agriculture. And really what's so important about this process is the community's involvement, the community's input, because really we're talking about bringing things back to the people and figuring out, what do our communities dream of when they are building together, because no community's dream for their town is a prison. Next slide. Thanks everyone for their time and attention today. Really encourage folks to download our roadmap. It's really, I think, a really innovative piece of work that's driving both narrative and legislative change in California. And really together, what we're all doing here is trying to address the critical issues of EJ, health disparities, and the urgent need for the decarceration of prison closures and a just transition to an earth that's a little healthier for everyone and a sustainable future for all of us.
Thank you so much, Brian. I've really loved following CURB's work because I think it really illustrates how you can take abolitionist praxis and still move the needle in a legislative context. So thanks everyone for the presentations. Now we're going to move to Q&A. Feel free to drop questions in the chat and I'll try to get to them as well. But I'll start with some of my own questions. So a challenge that has been started to be raised in the environmental justice literature over the last decade or two has really been the fact that this issue of environmental injustice in prisons has really been at the margins of even environmental justice spaces. Environmental justice literature and activism has tended to focus really more on neighborhoods, communities, things of that nature. And so I wanted to ask, and this is a question in particular for those who've been active in legislative activism. How have you engaged this challenge of trying to bring in kind of mainstream environmentalists or mainstream environmental justice activists to confront this issue of prisons and join you for collective action? And this is, in particular for, Ryan or May as well.
I guess I'll start. Well, I think it's kind of evidenced by the work that's been demonstrated today by Dr. Sakura and Dr. Purdom, bringing those arguments to the politicians. Literally, if I'm going to like practically explain this, when Dr. Purdom first did her report, we literally walked that to every office within the Texas Capitol, letting them know what exactly the findings are. Also doing things like amplifying that on social media, the reports that come out, letting them, we've had some private meetings with things like staffers that were involved to help them understand what's going on, and then also testimonies have been essential. I know Dr. Purdom has testified at the hearings at the Capitol during interim in the past. And then I've got to mention that also going back to that means of oppression, that's one of the things that the powers that be is now trying to fight. So now that more academics are entering the arena and they're presenting their research, we get other laws suddenly coming out of the woodworks, like to laws that impact tenure, or say no lobbying for those who are doing academic work. So it's a bit of a challenge, but essentially we're taking it, we're putting it into kind of layman terms, bite-sized pieces for these legislators, and presenting it wherever we possibly can.
Thank you. Brian, do you want to speak to that?
Sure, I think all those points are absolutely important strategies for organizing. And I think folks in the EJ community should keep including that in their convenings, in their literature, especially as we deepen our understanding of what a just transition means, and understanding prison as part of the construct of extractive economies. Having a fully interconnected movement for social change, I think, is going to be vital for all of our success.
And kind of building off of the comments about the use of research, what are some of the top highest priority, like, maybe research areas that you feel like would also push the needle in this broader conversation? And this can be a question for anybody.
Because I could speak to some research directions in the field. I've been broadly studying disasters and how hazards impact prisons for the last 8 or 9 years. And my background is in emergency management and in disaster mitigation, disaster response, just disasters broadly. And when I first started, there was basically nothing in the literature about what even happens to prisons and disasters. And now there's more interest because the impacts become, more and more visible with each passing year. But I definitely see a shift in terms of there's more research coming out, but there's still very, very little that has been done. And it's really, I think, just documenting what is happening. Many people we talk to in Texas don't even realize that the prisons don't have air conditioning until their loved one becomes incarcerated. So I think there's a lot of things that as we hope that our research can get the word out to people, and that they can we see a lot of, I think, support generally in the public for some of these legislative efforts. But when they realize that, prisons aren't being evacuated, that doesn't make sense. They're not getting food. They're not getting, there's a lot. People understand, I think, threats from hazards in a kind of clear, visceral way. So the more that I hope more attention continues to be put on, it's just documenting what is happening to prisons, what the risks are, why prisons are so different. Because people, they don't think about that prisons are built of heat trapping materials and certain styles that they're different than other infrastructure. And they don't think about how the way that, the way we incarcerate people, where you have hundreds and thousands of people in a place that we've designed to not allow anyone to leave ever, what that means in this climate, what that means with disasters. And it's not new. It's things that have always happened, but because of the populations that are incarcerated, they're overlooked. There's so little oversight. But I do think that there is a path being pushed forward, and I hope that by partnerships with researchers and organizers, and it doesn't even have to be partnerships, but we should be looking at how our research can support those efforts to reduce harm and death and disasters just in the baseline. It's a good place to start and to keep moving.
Absolutely, Carly. Julie, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I would just add a little of that. Like, totally. One, I think I've seen the field of environmental health and prison health explode over just like the past few years, like more and more interest. But I also like that environmental lens. When I think of where I'd love to see research to go, it's not like that environmental lens feels a little limiting in some sense. Like there's so many ways that prisons affect our health and the environment, like prisons are an environment within themselves, but I want to think about noise pollution. I want to think about like just other stressors within these environments that might not always fall under, when we think of climate change, might not always like connect with that, but the ways that this environment itself is detrimental to people's health, like focusing on that too, like heat is an issue that could maybe go away, but the prison itself like is always going to have this detrimental impact on people's health.
Absolutely, Julie, and thanks so much. And that connects to what we've heard from multiple people as well, starting with May, about the multi-pronged toxicity of prisons beyond the more recognizable environmental harms. So a question I want to go to is, I personally know like some of y'all or some of your organizations explicitly identify with abolitionist praxis. And for those who might not be familiar with that term, abolition is referring to the dismantling of prisons and policing and other arms of the prison industrial complex as well, and the belief that we can abolish prisons, move away from prisons, and create alternatives in their place. And so to that point, I want to kind of ask about some of the tensions between trying to, reform, quote unquote, the criminal justice system versus abolitionist approaches. And specifically, I'd love to hear like examples of reforms that people might, on face value, think are positive, but in your opinion, would actually do more harm than good.
I can speak to that. Yeah, I think that's a really excellent question. And CURB is a coalition. So not everybody in CURB identifies as an abolitionist, but we have to commit to an abolitionist strategy for organizing, which doesn't disrupt the work that's happening at the grassroots to make the most radical changes. And when we think about what abolition looks like in practice, I think one of the central components is that we aren't building things that we have to dismantle in the future. And that's what a lot of reform work does, because it is tinkering around the edges instead of addressing the root cause of the issue. And I think the most dangerous thing that's happening in California right now around this is what the Newsom administration is calling the California model. So this is an attempt to import the style of Norway and Norwegian incarceration to California. And right now that's best exemplified by the $380 million that they're investing to rebrand San Quentin as a rehabilitation center. So we know that this is just a different name for a prison that perpetuates the harms of incarceration, including systemic racism and violence, and that this prison is actually on Ella Baker Center's list as one of the most in danger from climate change. And in this case, it's flooding. So really, we have money being directed back into the prison system, just as we ought to be beginning to save dollars from decarceration and prison closure. So we know that this is an attempt for the PIC to morph and change in order to propel itself into the future and sustain its budget. So we're always really wary of reforms that come with a really hefty price tag, where 360 million of the $380 million that are going towards the rehabilitation center in San Quentin is just for a building. And a building is just a building the last time I checked.
Thanks. And maybe we can hear from just one or two more people on this. Carly, I see you.
Sure. So I've worked with some other scholars and some folks from toxic prisons, and we published a paper on looking at abolition and what that means for just this broad understanding of disaster resilience. And so I think that it's difficult to engage on an academic level. I mean, we've people kind of see the term abolition, and especially here where I am, it's sometimes difficult to engage on. But I think it's our role to look at, and maybe even that's a protection from being a disaster person, is that the field of disasters has underlying goals of reducing death and harm, and speaking to just a broad understanding of safety. And so by engaging with what does incarceration mean for safety and climate change and disasters, the evidence suggests that prisons do not make us safer. Incarceration does not make us safer. It undermines our resilience. And not only when we're talking about prisons as places that, like, we talk about them, and we can, if we don't look at or aren't able to engage critically with how they function and what their role is and what it means for broader society, then we can't have that understanding of resilience, and we can't reach a place of reducing vulnerability. But when we kind of engage directly with what is the role of prisons and incarceration and in disasters and climate, we see that they are producers of disaster risk. Just having that space there, it creates risk. It creates problems, not just for incarcerated people, but for the community that they're in. Having a criminal record, all of these different things we're engaging in. I think, coming from a disaster and emergency management background, we're able to kind of reframe these ideas of what is safety, what do people need to be safe and resilient. And when we come at it from that kind of perspective, we're able to see how we incarcerate people, what the way the system currently functions, that it creates more vulnerability and susceptibility to harm for not just incarcerated people, but to the broader community. So that's what we're seeing in our research, and we're trying to communicate that. It's sometimes difficult in like a field that's has very clear ideas on what public safety means, but we're able to critically engage in that area and push. I'd say with research, we talked about research a minute ago too, but I think that's a direction that the research is also going in. It's not difficult to see that prisons, you don't have to have a research background to see that there's problems here, but being able to show, make the relationships between what happened to, a family in disasters, having a criminal record, not being able to access housing, not being able to find stability after incarceration, or being impacted by the justice system, that creates disaster risk and impacts in anyone's community. So we're able to, I think that's where that critical engagement pushes us to really engage at what does safety mean? How can we have, a resilient society with a changing climate?
Thanks so much. No, those notes from Brian and Carly were really powerful things to end on. I think that abolition is something that all of us, both in the academic sphere and the organizing sphere, need to take more seriously, because if not, we run a risk of continuing to perpetuate harm in all sorts of parts of society. So I want to wrap up and just say thanks so much to all of the panelists for the time spent preparing and sharing with you about your research and perspectives on organizing as it relates to environmental racism in prisons. I hope everyone will take it upon themselves to research more into these issues, follow these organizations on social media, engage with their campaigns in any way that you can, find local campaigns you can touch base with, and yeah, just try to join this movement to fight toxic prisons. Thank you.
Thank you.